Okay, so hi everyone. This is the webinar on MyData Operators, and we will be hearing from Joss Langford, who is the lead editor of the MyData Operator white paper, which is titled Understanding MyData Operators. This is hosted by MyData Korea, and so we will be translating this and creating subtitles, and it will be posted on YouTube for your reference. And with that, I will hand it over to Joss.
Thank you, Chris. Hi, everybody. Thank you very much for joining this webinar. Over the next 25 minutes, I'm going to talk a little bit about the Understanding MyData Operators white paper that was published by MyData earlier this year in spring 2020. And I'm going to pick out some of the key elements of that paper and what it means for interoperability and MyData's mission around interoperability. The talk is called The Journey of Interoperability because that's why we did all this work around the operators. So I'm going to talk about interoperability first, and then I'll come on to a little bit about MyData Operators as part of the solution for that. Just to start off, just to give you a little bit of my background so that you know where I'm coming from, my perspective and my biases. I help run the MyData Operator Thematic group. The the Operator Thematic group, and my background is as an engineer, and there are a couple of roles that I have. One is as an executive director of the non-profit organization Coalition. And Coalition is a research technology organization that specializes in standards for data about people in the Internet of Things. Our work in Coalition comes out through the OASIS Open Standards Group, where I'm vice chair of the open standard group there that we support, which is the COEL group, Classification of Everyday Living. And that's a standard about transmitting data within the Internet of Things, where that data pertains to an individual. My commercial role is with a company called Activinsights, and Activinsights is a UK-based wearables manufacturer. And we provide wearables to healthcare professionals to help collect data about patients. I think it's important I put that in because I deal with personal data as a commercial organization on a day-to-day basis. So the work of MyData is really important to us about how we focus our efforts to be more human-centric. And lastly, I also have an academic role, an honorary fellowship at the University of Exeter, where I have 2 PhD students working in artificial intelligence and machine learning around data collected by wearables, so data about people. So I've got strong technical background and a key interest in standards as well. So starting off to talk about interoperability, one of the things that we found very helpful within MyData is to make sure we're clear about the terms we're using. What do we mean by interoperability? I know it seems obvious, but actually when you get into the topic, it's quite complicated and very interesting. So the best model that I know of, and this has been presented at MyData since I think 2016 was the first time that this model was put up, is called the Levels of Conceptual Interoperability Model, so the LCIM. And you'll see that's very widely referenced, and it is the core reference for interoperability that we use within the Understanding MyData's white paper. And it sets out these levels of interoperability. It's a stacked model, it's hierarchical, and it would sort of suggest that these build on top of each other. And our experience of working in this space is that that's not necessarily the case. We believe that these levels, you can advance different parts of this level at different stages. So at the bottom level, level 0, is where we have no interoperability at all. There's no way for systems to talk to each other. At levels 1 and 2, these are the basic levels of an API type interface to be able to agree a data structure to move from one system to another. Very basic but valuable technical interoperability. The second stage comes when we start making sure that the data that we move from one system to another means the same thing in those 2 systems. And that's where we start talking about semantic interoperability, and also what's used in the model of the term pragmatic interoperability. And that's more about the methods as well, our ability to work together. And that ability to work together then moves forward into that highest level, which is the organizational level, where we've got common roles and rules. And one nice way to think about this is particularly with that term dynamic, and that's the ability for systems to be able to change together and to continue to be interoperable. So we all know that we work within our organizations, things change and we evolve, we have objectives that we move towards. Where we move towards those objectives in common with other organizations and preserve interoperability, that's the highest level of interoperability that you can achieve. And in the paper, we pick out these three levels of organizational, semantic, and technical. We're just going to drop back and show how this model has been used in the European context, because I think it draws an important lesson for us. This is from the EIF, the European Interoperability Framework. There are other initiatives like this around this globally. Where you've got good examples of this locally, please let me know, because I do collect these. And here you can see the technical interoperability, the semantic interoperability, and the organizational interoperability that we've talked about. And they add a fourth one, legal interoperability. And because this is within a European context, within a common regulatory framework, they can be very confident about putting that element in. The thing to watch for, particularly within the European context, is that the discussion is now moving to how do we regulate for interoperability? How do we legislate for interoperability? So I think that what you're going to see over the coming years, particularly in Europe and I'm sure in other areas as well, actually legislations that mean there are certain ways of doing things that promote interoperability that you're going to need to follow to participate in particular market spaces. And I think this is going to be a really interesting development about how we use hard controls to drive interoperability as well as the softer benefits. So moving on then to why this focus of interoperability is so important. And there are four reasons here, which are the human-centric ones that we would use within MyData. There are engineering reasons and cost reasons as well, but for MyData, these are the core ones. Transparency and usability. Making sure that you've got systems that people know how they work and they know how to use them. That can be extended further to talk about standardizing interfaces for personal data. Interacting with a data environment is very difficult, and interoperability promotes standardization, which allows us to reduce the burden of interaction for individuals, and that's an important thing for us to do. It allows us to build roaming possibilities for individuals to move their data between different sectors as well as between different jurisdictions. It also allows substitutability. And what we mean by that is the ability for the individual to choose who is going to provide services. And in a sense of providing people freedom, choice is a really important route to delivering freedom. It's also a really important route to delivering innovation and healthy ecosystems, where systems can compete on benefits which are important to the individual. The individual needs to be able to move between them and have real effective choices within a marketplace. So that's why we're doing it. Then how do we go about doing it? And this is the top level of our journey towards interoperability. We think the first stage of this is to agree a common goal. And we have a great opportunity and advantage within MyData because we've got organizations that have come together against a common goal already. The next stage is to develop common understandings and definitions. And that is the role, the initial role of the Understanding MyData Operators white paper. It was there to set out our understanding of the space and to create some definitions that people could use consistently to describe what they did and why they did it. We move on from there to think about, well, now that we've got different actors, different organizations describing what they do in the same way, we can start to identify common processes. And a lot of the jobs that need to be done are very common between different services. So services that compete and don't compete will have very common elements. Once we've identified those, we can start to think about how we harmonize those and how we bring those under a common framework of governance. So we're at the early stages of that, but we think that we're beginning to make some good progress on this. So that's where we come into the MyData Operator. So the MyData Operator is the vehicle that we use to help make this happen. Anybody who's been with MyData for any period of time will be very aware of the ecosystem diagram, which is in the 2017 MyData Declaration. We call it the coat hanger diagram. because it makes it nice and easy to know which one we're talking about. And that sets out these 4 different types of actors: the person, the data source, the data using service, and the operator that helps orchestrate these interactions between the individual, their data, and things that they want to do with their data. What we've done within the MyData work is to start to move that forward. But if we look backwards, it's important to recognize that the MyData operator isn't in itself a new concept. It's been developed considerably, but we can trace the history of an operator as a trusted intermediary back to over 20 years ago. And I'm not going to go through all the elements on the slide here, but you can start to see some of the terms which have been used in the literature over the years, right up to some of the most recent work, again, with a European focus from the European Commission within the data strategy around this idea of personal data spaces. So it sits within a wider context of some very strong literature. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to move from the world that we see now to a world which places the individual at the center of their data. So if we take the current view, most organizations that are involved in the data space, and the larger organizations particularly, manage the whole of the value chain, the whole of the data chain. They collect the data, they provide the management services, and they are the facilitators of use for the individual. And in that model, it is very difficult to integrate data sources from multiple places. What we're aiming to move to is an environment where we collect and collect once, so we're not having to repeatedly collect the same data, where we put the individual at the center of managing that data. And that allows multiple scenarios of use and therefore reuse. And so you can start to see that if we can manage data better, we don't need to recollect. And so data using services will be able to pull on existing data sources. And we start to create an ecosystem. And so what we did within the MyData Operator paper is to expand that original diagram from the declaration to include multiple operators, multiple data sources, and multiple data using services. I think it was always implied that there would be multiple data sources and using services. But what we recognized when we looked at organizations that were delivering MyData Operator type services already is that they were quite specialized often. There were some that had broad services, but very often we recognized that even within a single interaction, an individual could choose to use multiple operators. You may use one service to manage permissions and consent, for example, and a different service to discover the types of data using services that they could use with their data. And then within that, once you recognize that there's an ecosystem, we have to think about what the governance of that ecosystem as well. So yeah, see this new added element of ecosystem governance. So the paper can be downloaded here. I encourage you to read it, and at least have a good look at it. But I'm going to give you the top lines of it as we go forward in this presentation. So within that paper, there are 5 key outputs: a definition of interoperability, a working definition that's usable, and I've talked to you about, and then 4 other elements that I'm going to touch on now. First of all, the reference model. This allows us to describe these actors, these role in a similar way, how we go forward to recognize MyData operators, and then a little bit around governance and business models. So moving forward first to the reference model. Here's some text from the paper itself. I'm going to read it out. The MyData operator reference model describes 9 functional elements of operators. These elements affect how easy it is for the individual to utilize personal data, how transparent and human-centric the use of this data is, and how well the infrastructure supports open competition. So that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to identify those key elements that fulfill that criteria. What's important to recognize is this is not a theoretical model. This is a model that's been pulled out of looking at the marketplace. We worked with over nearly 50 different, what we call proto-operators in this space, so people who were offering services that were very similar to where we've ended up to as a definition for the MyData operator. And it's been a process of looking at their systems, describing their systems, combining those descriptions, and then feeding those descriptions back to those organizations to see if they agree. And that's what we mean by this iterative synthesis. And so we get to a point where if you look at the paper, you'll see that there are over 40 authors of that paper. And all those authors have contributed both to the underlying understanding and also to the bringing together of a common understanding. The functional elements are those which are specifically relevant to operators, that help us differentiate between different types of operators and those that are directly valuable to individuals that are particularly human-centric. So you'll not see everything in there. So for example, we don't have a reference element for security because it's so common to all the operators, and we would consider that to be a hygiene factor, something that they would have to do anyway. And it's not in there because it's not important, but it doesn't help us when we want to describe the variety of these models within the marketplace. It's also important to say that we're not expecting all operators to have all of these functional menus, these functional elements. It's a menu that you can pick and choose from, and you can see very quickly when you analyze the marketplace that there are these different specialisms within this space. It's not designed as a template for a single complete implementation. So here are the elements within the reference model. And each of these have a detailed description. And if you drop into the paper, that's one of the areas it's quite easy to go and have a little look through and understand some of the depth here. But at top level, in the yellow on the left-hand side, we have the elements which are about the individual. They're about how the individual interacts with the system and who that individual is and how they're recognized. In the middle, in the gray, these are the elements around the service. How does an individual choose different services? How is that service delivered to them? How do they get value from it? If there's an actual monetary value, how does that happen? On the right-hand side in the blue, these are the elements which are about the data. So the data model management, going back to the semantic elements, how do I make sure the data means the same thing in different places? How do I transfer data? And we recognize that many operators provide personal data storage, which is somewhat different to the data source within the overall ecosystem model, because that's something which is very specific to the individual and only accessed by or on behalf of that individual. And so there's a dedicated block there for that personal data storage. And then wrapping around that, we've got these two elements of logging accountability. So how do I record data about transactions? And also governance support. So not the governance itself, but how the operator provides links and functionalities that support governance to the wider ecosystem and back to the individual. So moving on to recognizing MyData operators. Again, within the paper, and as I've done within this presentation, we use the metaphor of a journey of interoperability. And what we're trying to do is to lay out a roadmap about how we move forward. And we set out a first stage of minimum interoperability criteria for those operators. And then this overriding thing that the operators must strive to work towards and within open ecosystems. And again, the environment of MyData is fantastic for us there because it provides this environment where we've got organizations with a committed common purpose, and there's an expectation to work together and to be open within that environment. And we believe that that is the best context within which we can develop shared an understanding of interoperability. So those initial requirements around being considered a MyData operator are detailed a little bit more. And in the first stage, and this is the work that we've done this year, we recognized that it was very difficult to set criteria when we didn't understand and there wasn't good literature about what all these different operators did. And with the availability of this reference model, the first stage has been for organizations to self-describe their systems for personal data management with respect to that reference model. And it's been proved very successful. We're really very pleased about how well that reference model has allowed different organizations to describe their services. and they can break down the functionalities they have. And importantly, what they've then done is to talk about the technologies that they use within that, the state of development of those technologies, the state of maturity. And that's an enormous resource for us to be able to think about better and more comprehensive criteria going forward. The other thing that we've asked people to do is to demonstrate their alignment with the MyData principles. And again, we can do that quite easily through the MyData Declaration and support of the principles. And this is moving towards thinking about governance. And lastly, we've focused on this area around the business models, about how they demonstrate transparency, how they are clear about how they operate as an organization, and the measures that they have in place to ensure that the individual, the person, is the primary beneficiary of these services. So it's important to state that these minimum requirements are going to evolve, and they are evolving already, and we're beginning to think about what this program might look like for next year. But they can evolve because of the data that we've collected in this first year. That's what makes it possible to move forward on this journey. So far in 2020, these are the operators that we're celebrating as having put the time and effort into completing that self-description. And it does take some time. We've found that it can take a couple of days to do all this work. It's quite extensive. And so I think we should need to be very grateful to these organizations for the contribution that they've made in terms of describing themselves very openly to allow us to take this initiative forward. And there is one last opportunity in 2020 for this award. So the third round opens up on the 4th of November. And so if you're interested in that, then the application can be found at the link there, and there's some detailed guidance notes, and you can always contact the team and myself if you've got any questions about that. So moving forward then from how we recognize them to think about these two topics, and just a couple of slides on ecosystem governance and then business models. What we recognize in the paper is that balanced and fair relationships between people and organizations do not emerge automatically in personal data systems. We need to make some level of intervention. There needs to be explicit methods for human-centric governance to guarantee that MyData principles will be followed. And this is a piece of work that's growing now. There are a couple of groups within MyData that are thinking about how do we better define governance, and we're working hard to link to other groups outside MyData and to convene a wider discussion about this. And I think this will be a very strong theme for many organizations, including MyData, during 2021. Just to give it a little bit of context, within the paper, we recognize 3 tiers of governance. At the top level, there's a legislative environment, and we talked a little bit about that earlier. You know, within a single legislative regime, we can think about interoperability at that level. But at an ecosystem level, there are opportunities to have common rules that will work within different jurisdictions. And certainly, as MyData Global, that is part of the mission, is how do we think about turning these principles that we've been working into working rules of the road, which are applicable in multiple legislations. And so that ecosystem level governance framework can be a very powerful way to move and to be appropriate in different legislations. The other thing that we talk about a lot in the paper is this recognition that there is a specific relationship and responsibility of the operator towards the individual. And in the general sense, we've termed that as a duty of care. In some cases, that can extend to being a fiduciary responsibility. And there, the word fiduciary means that the operator needs to put the interests of the person, of their customer, the individual, in front of their own interests. And we see that in particular regulated environments in the non-digital world. We expect that of our teachers, of our doctors, and of our lawyers particularly. And we expect that we'll see the same sort of range of from just a duty of care to fiduciary responsibility in different sectors with different types of data in different relationships within this overall environment of MyData operators. So moving on to the business models. In the long run, if we believe that true interoperability is possible and it's to be expected, we need to think about the convergence of these business models. And that's not to say that there is a single business model. There will be multiple different business models. But we believe that it's likely to be not as disparate as we see today. And there's a lot of maturity that needs to evolve in this market space to make sure that these operators can be sustainable going forward. And an understanding of the business models is critical to that. One of the principles at this business level, which I think is very important, is that the flows of revenue must be as visible to the individual as the flows of data. And again, when we go back and look at the MyData Operator 2020 descriptions, that's one of the things that starts to come out from there for the first time, is being able to recognize that. And there's a lot of work that needs to be done in this area. And it's not for organizations such as MyData to say what the business model should be. I think the role here is to recognize that we all benefit from having sustainable human-centric operators, and helping those organizations to develop business models is beneficial for the whole ecosystem. And one of our tasks, I think, is to anticipate what these business models might be, so we can think about what needs to be in place to ensure that those models are human-centric and that organizations can communicate those human-centric benefits. Just a little detour off for one slide to talk about the MyData conference, because that's coming up in December. If you've got an interest to look further into the area of MyData operators, there are some great sessions that are run by operators and about operators in the conference this year in 2020. I've listed them there. The one there on the top on Thursday is particularly probably of interest within this group. I know that there are some great presenters from the team here that will be running that. There's some work around data spaces, around data sovereignty, so some decentralized systems are really interesting around Swarm. Work particularly around design as well, so how do we design services and how do we design user interfaces? There's a particular viewpoint on intermediaries from the EU and also from the LATAM region around operators. For those organizations that have got a global ambition, those will be very interesting to see how these types of organizations will be best facilitated in those different areas. And there's also a great session there on personal data stores, again of interest within this team here, I know, and also within the governance, which I touched on earlier. So there's a little bit of signposting for some good sessions that you might be interested in. So just to close out, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the ongoing steps. So one of the things that we found that we can do within MyData is to work as thought leaders. And increasingly, we can see that we can inform regulation development. There's great experience within the wider MyData community about how to inform policy. And we've got the opportunity to do that, and there's some knowledge to do that as well. And so we're very keen that we continue to do that. One of the Canadian Hub have just made a very significant submission to their national government around this area from their hub. And the operators group has been working very closely with the European Commission in some specific areas in the upcoming Data Governance Act that we expect to see in the next couple of weeks. The second point there is around city initiatives. One of the things we've noticed is that the city seems to be a unit of organizational capability which is well set up to take on the opportunities afforded by MyData and the operators. And I've listed there a couple of the European cities that I know of who are actively embracing MyData operators as a way of delivering a new digital future for their cities. So if you've got more examples of those, please let me know. But what we see is that at a country level, it can be a little bit clumsy, but smaller than a city, we don't have the economies of scale. And I think this is something that over the next year or two that we can concentrate more about how we support particular cities. So please reach out and get involved where you can see that can be important. Helsinki, for example, has actually used the MyData Operators 2020 application as part of their application process. They've taken some of the questions across and used our templates to help organizations describe how they are human-centric. From an internal perspective, there's more work that we need to do around understanding the MyData view on governance, and there's work that's coming up on that, and some further definition work around the other roles within that ecosystem, the data sources and the data using services. we're keen to support interoperability projects within the ecosystem. So within the MyData Operators's thematic group, what we found is in the application process where we can bring two organizations together, we very often create exciting conversations where they recognize the benefits of working together. And these sorts of micro collaborations, I think, are a very good way for us to drive the wider picture about what interoperability looks like at a global scale. There's work that we need to do and is ongoing around technical and semantic interoperability. There's an initiative that started again within the thematic group to look at a human-centric schema for personal data. So what are the very small number of very core attributes which define a human as an individual that could be common to all operators? And then lastly, the work that we're starting now and will continue to next year is how do we evolve the MyData Operator Award to make it better, more fit for purpose, more inclusive, and able to attract more organizations going forward. So that is my close. Thank you very much for your time, and I'd be delighted to have any questions. I hope we can have an interesting conversation.
Great. Thank you, Joss. That was really, really great. I learned a lot just watching the presentation. 혹시 질문 있으면은 채팅에 올려주시면 좋겠고요. I have some questions. I think actually I have I have a lot of questions, but I tried to categorize them in terms of the general MyData operator concept, and then how they would apply to Korea in our particular case. So I'll go with the general topics first. So you mentioned that you found that there was a need or for multiple operators in some cases, and I'm wondering how would you describe the difference of having multiple operators from say myself using a Google account and a Facebook account at this moment?
Okay, so I think there's really good examples of where some of these large, fully integrated offerings have operator functionality embedded into them. And so one of the things in the call for the paper is if we want to move forward on interoperability, it's not about tearing those systems down. It's about making those systems more modular so that I can begin to use some of my Google data in different places more easily. So I can treat my Google data as a data source, and I can use it as a data using service in such a way that I can actually log on somewhere else, use a data source from somewhere else, and then just pull in the Google services that I want without having to commit everything within that single player. So I think the two examples you give there are what I would describe as that sort of monolithic offering. You know, you can look at the reference model, you can see they do all the things in there, but you can't actually access any of them without committing completely to them. I think the opportunity then is to break those out so that you can extract that modularity, and then you can start to see that I might allocate, as an individual, I might allocate an agent for me to do all my permissions management. And I may want to do that. Some people may want to do that manually. They want to click every box to say yes and no. And we know that many other people will say, nah, you've got to, they'll choose an operator that represents the sort of person that they are and delegate the responsibilities. Yeah, I believe you know who I am. You go, you make the best choices you can for me, and just come and tell me if there's something you're not sure about or if there's something exceptional come out. So I might have a very specialized operator that does those permissions management, so that then when I log on to this more modular Google of the future, it's managing that aspect for me, and then I can allocate the other bits of the operator responsibilities to Google or to another independent small operator. Does that make?
Mm-hmm. No, yeah, that actually that makes a lot of sense. And some of the work that I've been doing is actually really closely related to the concept of an agent that you mentioned, where it has policies and it can handle requests on my behalf without having to bother me in the case where it knows what to do. So Yes, so then I guess maybe another question that I have about the paper is, so there was a comparison to the telecommunications and the finance industry for a good example of interoperability within the paper. And I was wondering, so maybe this is kind of, maybe you kind of already answered this, but in terms of Google and Facebook, do you see, how do you see their role changing? So what sort of changes, I guess, do you expect to see from Google and Facebook as we go forward? And it's a more interoperable ecosystem for personal data.
I think I'd probably come back to the point I made earlier around modularity.
Modularity.
I think that has to be the key. I don't think that, you know, we're in a position to recommend business models to those large organizations, and I don't think that we necessarily would expect them to listen to us. And so I think there are two aspects that come if you want to think about change. There are the regulatory options for change, but I would warn anyone away from relying on these markets being regulated into existence. When regulations change within a marketplace, and I think we will see that. I mean, you know, the US have been very clear that that is their intention, and the trajectory of the EU is equally clear. Regulation itself has always unpredictable outcomes, and that it's also true that large organizations with significant resources are always better placed to survive a change of regulations than smaller organizations. Now, a change will create more new small organizations, but it's not necessarily easy for small organizations to survive that change. So in that regulatory environment, I think there is things that need to be done, but we need to be careful not to expect this to happen because of regulation. And the challenge then is to be able to allow individuals to essentially to vote with their feet. And I think that then moves us back to thinking in that ecosystem where are those data using services, is to think, how do we work with people to develop services that people love, that inspire them, that are visionary, that make a difference to their world, but are built on those human-centric principles. So I think there are things that we can do from a number of different aspects, but we have to make this a desirable world for individuals to want to move towards. And that's a challenge, and it will take time, and we can learn how to do that. But I think where we can work within a larger community, we can do that much better and much more successfully, learning from each other.
I see. So in terms of telecommunications, right? So we have in Korea, I think, 3 major corporations that pretty much handle all of the mobile services in Korea. Do you think that how many operators would you say you expect to see? I mean, it'll be more than 3, would you say?
Yes, I think so. I mean, I think one of the things that we have is we're working within a slightly different environment. There are some good examples that we try to put in the paper, but it's important not to push those analogies too far. I think we will want to work within an environment which is really an open internet environment. Whereas where you're talking a situation where you've got 3 major players controlling all that infrastructure within the telephony network, I don't think we would say that we have an open telephony network. Right. So we're starting from a slightly different base. You can see in other markets how that's changed. I think the banking industry is quite interesting as well. And certainly I know the UK situation more, but I understand in Europe there are similar challenges, and I'm sure there are in the rest of the world as well, where you have dominant players trying to regulate to allow more operators to come in. What happens is that those banking operators are quite niche, and they struggle to survive. But in both the cases of the telephony and the banking, the examples we're choosing there are established markets where we're asking for wholesale change. I know that we have some large dominant players within the personal data space, but I mean, we're far from being a mature and developed market in this space. And a lot of personal data regulation is interestingly ahead of the curve. It's forward thinking, and that's certainly what the European Commission would be set out their ambition with the GDPR and the linked legislation is to be ahead of and leading and part of social change rather than responding to a market change, which is what's happened within the telephony markets. So I think we do have a different picture. We do have different opportunities, and we would want there to be a good multiplicity of choices for an individual.
Yes, that's a great answer. I think you touched up on the points that I really wanted to hear. So the reason why I think the vision of the ecosystem is important is because in the case of Korea, and now I'm going to go to explain you a little bit about Korea and asking your advice on the strategies that we have. So there, just recently in August, there was a change in our law. It was called in Korean, it's called the 3 data laws, and it affected the personal information protection act, the Credit Information Protection Act, and the Network and Telecommunications Protection Act. I think it's Protection Act. But basically, the changes that happened was these were all human-centric changes, right? So basically, the idea behind it was that the person should be in control of their data, and so there's now a new industry in Korea that was born on August 5th, and they're calling it the MyData industry, right? So, and they're actually using MyData as one word with a capital M and a capital D. So, I believe it was to some extent based on the MyData principles. Now, this is a highly regulated industry where only a select few companies will be allowed to provide these MyData services. And the MyData services entail in terms of our principles, it entails putting the individual as the center of integration for their data, right? So the MyData businesses are the only type of businesses that are allowed to provide a integrated view of a person's finances. And this industry is actually it's focused on the finance industry at this point, right? So now what's happening though is these companies that are applying for the license, they are kind of in a battle to be the first to the market. And the reasoning behind this is because they want to lock in customers, right? And I think this kind of goes against the principles of MyData, but yet I think it's kind of difficult to persuade these companies to go about it in a different way. So the question I want to ask you is, what are your views on these types of lock-in strategies, and what could be some incentives that we might be able to describe to these companies to want to enable a more free-flowing, interoperable type of ecosystem?
Yeah, it's an interesting challenge for policymakers, isn't it? I think one thing that I'd be careful of is that you're describing this first mover advantage. You're describing that there is an opportunity, or that commercial organizations see an opportunity to deliver a return on investment by being the first mover into this space. The level of lock-in that achieves or is facilitated is an interesting question, and how hard that lock-in is and how soft that lock-in is an interesting challenge. But one of the things to remember is that if they didn't see that first mover advantage, we wouldn't see investments in that industry space. So, and I think it's very risky for them. and I think this is acknowledged. If you talk to established operators, you'll see that the appetite for risk and the chances that the market may change in ways that they don't expect when they have already invested quite dramatically in that market space are quite profound. The task of those first movers is to educate the marketplace. And it can often be the case that educating a marketplace or educating themselves about how to operate in a marketplace actually costs more than they will ever deliver back from that market. And when that happens, we have a situation that we would describe as second mover advantage. Now, if at the outset, everyone only ever saw follower opportunities, we'd never see any investment in the space. And so it's a balance between getting organizations to say, look, I want to do this. I want to get involved in this space, and then creating policy and adapting policy such that that market can be somewhat controlled and regulated to ensure the individual is at the center of it. I guess my perspective is, not knowing the particular environments, that this is to come down to choice and how that lock-in is controlled, and that the battles that you've seen with the European Union over the years with, I mean, initially Microsoft, you know, you're going back many years about the lock-in that was achieved there. Those were almost hard lock-ins. And you can see now the battles that will happen with Amazon and Google and the like. I think give an indication about to policymakers and regulators that they need to look for the signs of this occurring very early and to be able to move on the basis of that. And in these fast changing spaces, it's more about understanding the principles rather than setting these very hard rules that you know organizations will always work to the edge of the law to create a market imbalance that favors their products and services over their competitors. That's what they're going to do. That's what the competitive environment is. And so the challenge is to make sure that is done at a principles level with the individual at the center, which means that as the features and functionality of the market evolve, we can always come back to the principles and say, yeah, okay, in this particular environment, the rule said this, but it's based on this principle. You're violating the principle, even if you're not violating the actual letter. And it gives a regulator the opportunity to give a notice to say, we're going to, if you don't step back from this line, we will regulate in that space. And I think that's how perhaps we have to think about taking these forward. The other approach is to think about how governance sits in between this. So how do we use that governance so that we can encourage those organizations to self-regulate so that they don't have to pull the regulator forward to control that market space for them. And so there is a strong role for us in our communities to develop what do we mean by governance and to help the policymakers and to help organizations with soft law options that sit within that space.
I see. Great. Thank you. So I think you actually helped me realize something, that there wouldn't be any investment if they didn't see this opportunity, right? So I think in a way, it's actually really good that we do have active movement and investments going on. We actually are seeing all of the major banks in Korea applying for this license. So hopefully they will create this sort of a stage upon which we can have further developments for MyData operators and the principles. I wanted to ask another question about you mentioned that the city initiatives, right? You mentioned that smaller than a city level doesn't have economies of scale. Would you be able to elaborate a little bit more on this and what you mean by that?
Yeah, so I think if you take a city as a unit of economic activity, and a decent sized city relative to the environment, what you'll often see is that service providers will have localized services for that city. So if that's telephony services or sewage services, anything, you can see that there's a natural, and so that the distances that people need to travel to create working environments and local ecosystems where things actually happen on the ground is controlled. That density of people together helps them to save costs. So if you look at some of the challenges about working in more rural environments, just that physical space gives a challenge. So these elements of, I mean, they're called proximity. And when we talk about proximity, we're not just talking about the physical proximity or geographic proximity, we're talking about the cognitive proximity. So do the people within an area all think the same way? We're talking about organizational proximity, how closely matched are organizations' organizational values. And there are some other good things that you can look at if you look at proximity as a topic. A city provides a good concentration of very closely aligned individuals and businesses that have got the facilities to work together. And that you'll see that in smaller towns and smaller areas, but it's more difficult for them to be able to offer something that looks like a return on investment if they don't have the pure numbers of people. In a human-centric environment, we're going to, the opportunity is counted in the number of bodies. And where we can bring a certain critical mass of people together that can make those choices to choose human-centric services, then they're more likely to succeed. And the city offers that opportunity as well as that reduced cost and reduced complexity for a service provider that's going to operate within the space.
So would you say that each city should have their own MyData operator that they use, or should it facilitate an ecosystem of operators?
So the reason that I picked up on the cities is that that's where there are initiatives where we can put the MyData principles and the kind of roadmap that we've identified into practice early. One of the things within the paper that we talk a lot about is interoperability between operators, and that's both with operators with different functions, but also operators with the same function so that people can choose between them. So I would anticipate that you will see different operators running in different cities. I would anticipate that sometimes those operators will be run by the same organizations, but the ability for us to scale, the ability for us to learn, to control cost in our engineering, to reduce risk by reusing well-known engineering is going to come about because those operators are interoperable between cities. And so where there are service providers, that interoperability is key. And that means that they can be the same organization or they can be different organizations. At the city level, there's also an interesting thing about the city administration, because it gives us the opportunity to think about the operator as a link into government and a link into government data. And there's no surprise that a lot of the drive from MyData has come from Finland, because they're very good at understanding how to create that link. And so city administrations will, I suspect, be operators themselves. If you think about the definitions, they're going to be, they've got a responsibility already to their citizens. They have identity solutions in place. They need to be able to reach out to these people to empty their bins, to service their roads. Individuals want to be able to reach back into those organizations, data coming back through the way, to be able to report issues in the city and feedback on the city. And the data that's collected within a city, within an IoT space, is collectively the opportunity or the opportunity of those citizens, and city initiatives want to be able to make that data available to individuals. So you can see this lovely sort of civic link that comes up within a city, as well as those commercial opportunities, and those will clearly be city by city. But cities are quite good at learning from each other and watching what each other are doing. So again, we'll see that interoperability roll out through that, I hope.
Yes, that sounds great. I think I can see now why city level MyData operators would be really, really important and meaningful. One last question then. So going back to like one of your first slides, you mentioned the European interoperability framework, and you mentioned that the legal interoperability part of it is something that was kind of special. Now, I'm wondering, so in terms of MyData operators, say if we want to create a sort of interoperability between Korea and Singapore, then I think the legal interoperability aspect of it would become very important. And so what would you say would be the steps that we should take in creating this interoperability? Should we have two operators on both sides and then try to link them, or should we try to maybe start with what can be interoperable first, and then create our operators on top of that? And so, kind of the stages, if you know what I mean. What would you recommend?
Well, I think the levels of interoperability is an interesting thing to starting point. And I think it's important to be able to demonstrate. It's a question, I suppose, about the change that you want to achieve. I am sure that there are mechanisms that data can be shared and practice can be shared between two legislations, any two legislations as they are at the moment. I mean, I run services in the UK, so I'm in a really interesting situation of moving from a position of legal equivalence with the EU to not having an equivalence agreement on GDPR. And so practically what I'm noticing is that where I've got two organizations which are well aligned and have got shared objectives, we already work together. So the advantage there, we already work together and we've got shared data types and we know how we're going to classify that data. We've already got some organizational interoperability there. We've got some understanding about the technical interoperability. We know how to exchange data through APIs, and we've got those semantic levels there. And what's happening is, rather than having to rely on both being within a common legal area, we're having to create data transfer agreements, very specific on a bilateral basis, which is messy, but doable, but shows that we can continue working together. And so if you sort of turn that around, I think if you can find two organizations that want to work together using human-centric principles, so you can establish that organizational interoperability. And I think the MyData community and the MyData message and that wrapper is a brilliant way to do that. Because if you know that if someone's walking towards you on the premise that they want to be involved in MyData, you know you're going to be able to work with them to a certain extent. I'd say then the next challenge is to work to go, well, what's the project that I can use to create some semantic and some technical interoperability? And that stage, then you can go to the lawyers and you go, right, this is what we want to do. How do we do it in the current framework of the legal agreements between our countries? What are the issues? And from there, then you can talk to policymakers, because then you're going to say, look, this is the change I want to achieve. This is how I have to do it at the moment. If we did this, this, and this, it would be much easier. But also, you can communicate the benefit. You can say that because we're talking to each other, we are able to deliver to individuals benefits that they wouldn't have otherwise. We're able to deliver, probably you will want to be talking about economic growth. You may be able to show, for example, that if you can't work, if it's not a topic of economic growth, it may be about, for example, the Sustainable Development Goals. So how could you deliver against other recognized metrics better by that change that you want to see at that legal level? And I think that if you can start to do that and create multiple examples of that, then you're giving a path for policymakers to be able to follow, and it's very clear both what you want them to do and why they should do it.
Great, thank you so much. Actually, so as you were speaking, I had another question pop in mind. So this will be the really last question. So the stages that you mentioned are, they have to do with governance and I think a sort of a policy level of working together. At what stage would you say the standards and the protocols for technical interoperability should come in? Should they come in towards the beginning or middle, or is that something that should also happen in stages?
So there in many areas, there are some really good standards out there that you can already use to define many aspects. I think that there are new problems and that have been created out of regulation, or new opportunities created out of regulation, where we don't have standards yet. And for example, the work I've been involved in and is strongly supported is thinking about permission control and consent, for example. These are technical challenges about communicating consent and what that means. These are very complex spaces, and they've evolved out of the changes of legislation that we've seen over the last 10 years. Those standards are still being formed. But I think it's important to work with that and to support those initiatives, but not miss out on the fact that there are many very good engineering standards out there for communicating data between systems and for controlling semantics between systems. And we should be aiming to reuse as much of that as possible, whilst recognizing where new standards are needed. And those, it's also then important to think about how new standards actually come into creation, or what a standard is. A standard is the common practice ultimately. And sometimes in standards creation, we get it the wrong way around. You know, we create a specification theoretically. We call that a standard because it's come from a standard development organization, SDO. We say this is a standard. If no one's following it, it's not a standard. Whereas you can see a dominant player within a marketplace, or this is saying this is how we organize the data. You can use it if you want, or worse, you'll have to use it. We're looking for the former. And you'll see that those will become standards as well. And I think in many spaces around personal data, we can see both those processes going on in the moment, where we need new standards, and it will take some time to form out. Standards are great once they've been in market for many years, because that reduces the cost, that reduces the risk, particularly because we're talking about privacy risk here. And so where we're looking at new standards, I mean, I think the DID's movement is a really good example. There's some really exciting things happening around distributed identifiers. And you're beginning, now that those engineering specifications are emerging, you're beginning to see risk assessments on them, where people go, is this right? Is this right? And so we're having to think about that, and we're creating the conversation. So we've got to be careful when we engineer our systems, which have got data about people, that we do it in a safe, risk-controlled way. And the most recent specification is not always the best way to do that, but it's important we contribute to them so that we can make them better in the future.
Great, thank you. So you use what we can, reuse what we can, and when it comes to the technical standards. Okay, great.
I should have said that. That was much better
no,
evaluation than mine.
Well, thank you so much, Joss. I think this was a really great session, and yeah, I look forward to interacting with you more at the conference and even before then on Slack.
Thank you, everybody, and thank you for the opportunity and the invitation to speak.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, Joss. Thank you, Chris, for organizing it.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.